Welcome to this quiet journey through one of history's greatest stories. Tonight we travel back over 2,000 years. We follow a young man who changed the entire world before he turned 33. He grew up in a small kingdom that most people ignored. He studied under the greatest mind of the ancient world. He led armies across deserts, over mountains, through blizzards and sandstorms. He walked into cities that had never seen a Greek face before. And everywhere he went, he brought something new. New ideas, new trade routes, new ways of thinking. His name was Alexander, and his story is stranger and more beautiful than any legend ever captured. If you are settling in for the night right now, good. Let the day go. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breathing slow. This story will carry you. I am glad you are here. Before we follow Alexander on his journey, let me tell you something most people never learn. We think of him as a conqueror, a warrior, a destroyer. That's the easy version of the story. But here is what nobody tells you about Alexander the Great. He cried when there were no more worlds left to discover. He slept with a copy of Homer under his pillow alongside a dagger. He founded more than 70 cities in a single decade. He was terrified of his own father, and he died in the most powerful city in the world at 32 years old, asking questions that nobody could answer. The truth of Alexander is not a war story. It is a story about a boy who wanted to know everything, who could not stop moving, who loved too hard, fought too hard, and burned too bright for the world he was born into. Let us start at the beginning. Long before the armies and the legends, there was a classroom. There was a curious child. And there was one of the greatest teachers who ever lived. That is where our story really begins. If you are using this to fall asleep tonight, that's exactly why I make these videos. So maybe subscribe and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is. I always check the comments, and it genuinely moves me. Someone in Sydney at midnight, someone in Edinburgh at sunrise, someone in Chicago lying in the dark. All of us connected through one ancient story. Wherever you are tonight, I am glad you are here. Let us go back to the beginning. Part 1. The Boy from Macedonia. The kingdom of Macedonia was not considered important. Not by the great cities of Greece anyway. Athens had its philosophers and its democracy. Sparta had its warriors and its iron discipline. Corinth had its merchants and its wealth. But Macedonia in the north was something different. The Greeks called Macedonians barbarians, not because they were cruel. The word barbarian simply meant outsider in ancient Greek. It meant someone who did not speak Greek properly. Someone who lived outside the elegant circle of Greek civilization. And the Macedonians, with their mountain dialect and their wild horses and their mud brick palaces, were definitely outsiders. But Macedonia had one thing the other Greek states were struggling with: a king who knew exactly what he wanted. His name was Philip II, and he was Alexander's father. Philip had spent time as a hostage in the city of Thebes when he was young. He was forced to live there as a guarantee of peace between Macedonia and the southern Greeks. While he was there, he studied. He watched how the Theban army trained. He saw their famous sacred band, an elite fighting force of 150 pairs of soldiers who were bonded together by deep personal loyalty. He observed how they moved on a battlefield, how they used discipline and geometry and timing to destroy larger armies. Philip was a young captive in a foreign city, but his mind was working every single day. When he returned to Macedonia and eventually became king, he built something nobody had seen before. He built the greatest army in the ancient world. He trained his soldiers into units called the phalanx, rows of men carrying long spears called sarissas, some of them 18 feet long. When a phalanx unit moved forward in perfect formation, it looked like a moving wall of iron. Nothing could break it from the front. Philip also recruited skilled cavalry, specialists in sieges, engineers who could build machines to break city walls. He took a rough northern kingdom and turned it into a military machine. But here is something important. Philip did not just want to conquer. He wanted to be respected. He wanted Macedonia to be seen as a real civilization, not a rough northern territory full of horse breeders and wine drinkers. A real place with real greatness. That desire shaped how he raised his son. Alexander was born in 356 BC. The city was Pella, the capital of Macedonia. The palace was nothing like the marble temples of Athens. It was functional and large, and built for a king who was always preparing for war. Alexander's mother was named Olympias. She was a princess from the region called Epirus to the west of Macedonia. She was fierce and proud and deeply spiritual. She believed in old gods and old mysteries. She raised Alexander to believe he was not just the son of a king. She told him he was the son of a god. The god Zeus himself, she said, had favored their bloodline. Whether she believed this completely, or whether it was a mother giving her son the most powerful possible foundation for confidence, we cannot know for certain. But Alexander believed it, and that belief would shape everything. He grew up in a palace full of soldiers and advisors and horse trainers. He grew up watching his father plan campaigns and negotiate alliances and punish enemies. He saw early that the world rewarded strength and intelligence and ruthlessness in equal measure. But he also grew up reading. He loved stories above almost everything else. His particular obsession was the Iliad, the great poem about the war at Troy. He memorized huge sections of it. He kept returning to the figure of Achilles, the greatest Greek warrior, unstoppable in battle, burning with pride and grief and passion. Achilles had been given a choice by a prophecy. He could live a long, quiet life and be forgotten, or he could live a short, blazing life and be remembered forever. Achilles had chosen the flame. Alexander had decided, before he was even a teenager, that he would make the same choice. His parents hired him a tutor when he was around 13. But this was not just any tutor. This was Aristotle, the greatest philosopher of the ancient world, possibly the greatest intellect who ever lived. Think about that for a moment. The future conqueror of the known world sat in a garden in Macedonia and was taught by a man who had studied everything: physics, ethics, politics, drama, poetry, logic, medicine. Aristotle had spent time at Plato's Academy in Athens. He had studied the natural world with a scientific curiosity that would not be matched for almost 2,000 years. He had opinions about everything and the ability to defend them with devastating precision. And for 3 years, he focused much of his attention on one teenager from Macedonia. The location of their lessons was a place called Mysa, a peaceful wooded area with gardens and covered walkways. Alexander and a small group of elite students walked with Aristotle among the trees. They debated, they questioned, they argued. Aristotle encouraged his students to look at the world directly, not to simply accept what they were told, but to observe, to measure, to think. He taught Alexander to ask why. That question would follow Alexander for the rest of his life. Why did this city fall? Why do different peoples worship different gods? Why do rivers in Egypt flood at a different time than rivers in Greece? From Aristotle, Alexander also received something rarer than information. He received a sense of the world's scale. Aristotle showed him maps. He described the lands to the east, the Persian Empire, vast beyond imagining, India, further still, oceans no Greek had ever reached. And Alexander stared at those maps the way a hungry person stares at food. He wanted to go there. He wanted to go everywhere. But first, he had to survive his own family. Part 2. A Kingdom on the Edge. Life inside the Macedonian royal palace was dangerous. King Philip had multiple wives, as was common for powerful kings of that era. Multiple wives meant multiple heirs. Multiple heirs meant constant rivalry, suspicion, and the constant threat of violence. Alexander's position was never completely secure. His mother Olympias fought hard for his status. She reminded everyone who would listen that Alexander was Philip's true heir. She cultivated allies among the nobles. She made enemies among anyone who threatened her son. Philip, meanwhile, was often away on campaigns. He was expanding Macedonia, absorbing neighboring territories, bringing Greek city-states under his influence through a combination of force and diplomacy. And Philip had a complicated relationship with his brilliant son. On one level, he was proud. There is a story, probably true, about the day Alexander tamed a horse that no one else could ride. The horse was called Bucephalus. He was a magnificent animal, large and black, with a white star on his forehead. Philip had paid a huge sum for him, but the horse was wild. Every rider who attempted to mount him was thrown immediately. Philip's horsemen tried one after another. Bucephalus reared, spun, charged. The king decided the animal was useless and ordered him taken away. Alexander was watching. He was about 12 years old. He said he could ride the horse. Philip was irritated. He told his son not to embarrass himself. Alexander made a bet. If he failed, he would pay the cost of the horse himself. Philip accepted, probably expecting his son to be thrown in the dust. Alexander walked toward the horse slowly. He had noticed something the adult handlers had missed. Bucephalus was frightened of his own shadow. The animal kept spinning away from the darkness he saw on the ground. So Alexander turned the horse toward the sun. He walked him forward, letting the shadow fall behind. When the horse calmed, Alexander swung up onto his back. Bucephalus ran, but Alexander stayed on. He guided the horse in a wide arc and returned to the crowd. Philip was watching his son ride back toward him, and he reportedly said, with tears in his eyes, that Macedonia was not big enough for Alexander. He needed a larger kingdom to match him. But that pride existed alongside tension. Philip knew his son was extraordinary. He also knew that extraordinary sons sometimes become impatient. There were moments when they clashed badly. At a royal banquet, when Philip announced a new marriage that seemed to threaten Alexander's position as heir, a public argument exploded between father and son that was violent and humiliating. Philip drew his sword. He lunged toward Alexander. He tripped and fell. Alexander stood over his father, furious and shaken. He looked down and reportedly said, "Here is the man preparing to cross from Europe to Asia, and he cannot even cross from one table to another." He left Macedonia and took his mother to safety in Epirus. The rift between father and son lasted months. It was eventually patched over, but the scar remained. And then in 336 BC, everything changed in a single moment. Philip was attending a festival at the city of Aigai. It was a grand celebration. Theater performances, processions, feasting. Philip entered the theater. He was assassinated. A bodyguard named Pausanias drove a dagger into him. Philip was dead before he hit the ground. He was chased down and killed before he could be questioned. The reasons behind the assassination were argued about then and are still debated now. Was it personal revenge? Was it a political conspiracy? Were foreign powers involved? We do not know for certain. What we know is what happened next. Alexander was 20 years old, and he was now king of Macedonia. He moved fast, faster than anyone expected. He eliminated potential rivals before they could organize against him. He secured his own generals and his father's most loyal officers. He sent messages to the Greek city-states confirming that Macedonian military dominance would continue. When some cities tried to use the chaos of Philip's death to rebel, Alexander led his army south with stunning speed. The rebels were not ready for him. He appeared before their walls before they had finished their arguments. The rebellions collapsed. The boy king had made himself king in fact, not just in name, within weeks of his father's murder. And now he turned his eyes east. He was ready to go. Part 3. The burning of Thebes and the road to Persia. Before Alexander could cross into Asia, he had unfinished business in Greece. He needed the Greek city-states fully behind him, or at least fully afraid of him. There was a city that decided to test him: Thebes. Thebes had been one of the most powerful cities in Greece for decades. It had crushed Sparta in battle, with its famous sacred band. It had dominated Greek politics during Philip's youth, the same city where Philip had been held hostage as a boy. When Alexander moved against it in 335 BC, Thebes chose to fight. This was, by any rational calculation, a catastrophic decision. Alexander's army was professional, battle-hardened, brilliantly organized. The Theban forces were brave, but unprepared for what hit them. The battle was brief and savage. The sacred band, those 150 pairs of elite soldiers who had never been broken on a battlefield, were surrounded and destroyed to the last man. They died fighting. Not one of them ran. When Thebes fell, Alexander made a decision. He destroyed the city. Not just defeated it, destroyed it. The walls were torn down, the buildings were burned. The population, about 30,000 people, was sold into slavery. It was brutal. It was calculated. It sent a message to every other Greek city that the cost of open rebellion was total destruction. Alexander spared only the temples and the house of the poet Pindar, whom he admired. Even in his most ruthless moment, there was this: he saved the house of a poet. The Greek cities that had been watching fell very quiet. Athens sent ambassadors immediately. Sparta stayed home and said nothing. The message had been received. Alexander was ready to cross into Asia. In the spring of 334 BC, he led an army of approximately 37,000 men across the narrow stretch of water that divided Europe from Asia. It was called the Hellespont. Today we call it the Dardanelles, a narrow sea passage between modern Greece and Turkey. Standing on the bow of his ship, crossing that water, Alexander picked up a spear and threw it ahead of him toward the Asian shore. He was claiming Asia with his weapon before he even stepped onto its soil. He stepped off the boat and drove the spear into the ground. He was the first man ashore. Then he walked to a nearby site that every educated Greek knew was sacred: the ruins of Troy, the city from the Iliad, the city where Achilles had fought and died. Alexander was doing something that went far beyond military planning. He was announcing his story. He was telling the world and telling himself that this campaign was not just conquering, this was something eternal. He honored the grave of Achilles. He offered at the shrines. His close friend Hephaestion honored the grave of Patroclus, Achilles' beloved companion. The message was clear to anyone who knew the old stories. Alexander was Achilles, and the Persian Empire was Troy. The adventure was beginning. Part 4. The First Battles and a New Kind of King. The Persian Empire was enormous. Try to imagine it. It stretched from Egypt in the west to the edge of India in the east, from the Black Sea in the north to the Persian Gulf in the south. It had been built by a series of great kings, starting with Cyrus the Great over 200 years before Alexander was born. At its height, it contained around 50 million people. It held dozens of different cultures, speaking dozens of different languages. It had the richest treasury in the known world, and it was ruled in 334 BC by a king named Darius III. Darius was not incompetent. He was a real ruler, intelligent, politically skilled, but he had inherited an empire with cracks in it. Years of palace intrigue had weakened the center. Provincial governors, called satraps, had become almost independent rulers in their own regions. The Persian army was massive, but not well unified, and nobody in Persia had yet taken the young Macedonian king seriously. That was their first mistake. Alexander's first major encounter with Persian forces came at a river called the Granicus, in what is now northwestern Turkey. The Persian commanders drew up their cavalry along the far bank. They expected the Macedonians to halt and wait, to survey the position, to send scouts, to plan carefully. Alexander did not wait. He charged directly across the river. His cavalry led, crashing through the water, climbing the opposite bank under fire. The fighting at the top of the bank was desperate and close. Two Persian commanders targeted Alexander personally. He was fighting in the front rank, as he always did. He was almost killed. A Persian raised his sword to cut Alexander down from behind. His general Clitus, known as Clitus the Black, severed the Persian's arm at the shoulder. Alexander survived by moments. The Persians were routed. The road into Asia Minor was open, but here is where the story becomes surprising. Alexander did not march through the conquered territory like a plunderer. He treated the local populations with careful respect. Most of Asia Minor had been under Persian control for a long time. The Greek-speaking cities along the coast had suffered under Persian governors. When Alexander arrived and removed those governors, he was often greeted as a liberator. He replaced Persian rulers with local administrators. He reduced the tribute payments that the Persian Empire had demanded. He told the cities they were free. Many of them believed him, and many of them were right to believe him. He was genuinely interested in the people he was conquering. He asked about their customs. He visited their temples. He honored their gods under their local names, recognizing the same divine forces under different cultural clothing. This was something unusual in the ancient world. Most conquerors simply imposed their own gods and their own rules. Alexander understood something deeper. People do not surrender their hearts to someone who destroys everything they love. They surrender their hearts to someone who honors what they love while showing them something better. He moved southeast through modern Turkey, approaching the great city of Gordium, and there he encountered a famous puzzle, the Gordian knot. It was an incredibly complex knot tied around a pole in the temple of the great god Zeus. The legend said that whoever could untie the knot would become the ruler of all Asia. Many had tried, none had succeeded. Alexander studied it. He tried to find the end of the rope. He could not. Then he drew his sword and cut the knot in half. Some say he simply pulled the pole out of its socket, releasing the ropes that way. Either way, the result was the same. He had solved the problem, not by following the rules of the puzzle, but by changing what the rules were. That was Alexander. When the world gave him a problem that seemed impossible, he found a way to reframe the problem itself. He moved on. He was heading toward Persia, and Darius III was finally starting to take him seriously. Part 5. Darius, Isis, and the family in the tent. The second great battle came in 333 BC at a place called Issus, near the northeastern corner of the Mediterranean Sea. This time, Darius himself was present. He had assembled a massive army. Ancient sources give numbers that are certainly exaggerated, some claiming several 100,000 men. Modern historians estimate something more like 100,000 Persian soldiers against Alexander's approximately 40,000. Still, a significant numerical disadvantage for the Macedonians. But Alexander had advantages that numbers could not capture. His army was unified, trained together, led by officers who trusted each other completely. The Persian army was a coalition of different peoples with different loyalties, and Darius, despite his real abilities, was facing Alexander. The battle was fought in a narrow coastal plain, hemmed in by mountains and sea. This was actually bad for the Persians. Their numerical advantage was neutralized. They could not spread out. They could not outflank. Alexander attacked directly toward Darius himself. The Persian line held at first, but as the Macedonian phalanx pushed forward with its wall of long spears, and as Alexander's cavalry smashed through on the right side, the Persian formation began to crumble. And then Darius did something that would follow him forever. He fled. He left his chariot. He leaped onto a horse. He rode away from the battlefield. His army, seeing their king disappear into the dust, collapsed. The rout was total. The Persian camp was captured, and inside that camp, Alexander found something extraordinary. Darius's family, his mother Sisygambis, his wife Statera, his daughters. They had come to watch the great victory of their king. Now they were prisoners. They did not know if they would be executed, enslaved, or something worse. When Alexander entered the tent where they were being held, his companion Hephaestion walked beside him. Sisygambis, the Persian queen mother, bowed before Hephaestion. She thought he was Alexander. Hephaestion was taller, more obviously regal-looking. She was quickly told of her mistake. She was horrified. She apologized desperately. She had insulted the conqueror. Alexander stepped forward and said something that would be remembered for centuries. He said it did not matter. He said that Hephaestion was also an Alexander. Then he guaranteed the safety of the entire family. He told them they would be treated as Persian royalty. Their servants, their customs, their dignities would be preserved. He called Darius's mother his own grandmother. He called Statera his sister. He treated them with complete courtesy and genuine warmth. This was not just kindness, it was brilliant politics. By treating the Persian royal family with honor, Alexander was sending a message to all of Persia. He was not their destroyer, he was their new king. He honored Persian traditions because he intended to rule through Persian traditions. He was thinking generations ahead. He was already imagining an empire. Part 6. The Road Through Egypt and the Desert God. After Issus, Darius sent messengers. He offered a peace deal. He would give Alexander all the territory west of the Euphrates River if Alexander would stop advancing. He offered his daughter in marriage. He offered 10,000 talents of gold. Alexander's senior general Parmenio reportedly said that if he were Alexander, he would accept those terms. Alexander replied that if he were Parmenio, he would accept them too. But he was Alexander. He marched south. He needed to secure the coastline before pushing deeper into Persia. The city of Tyre, on an island off the coast of what is now Lebanon, refused to surrender. It had never been taken. It was considered invincible. The city sat on an island. Its walls rose directly from the sea. Its navy could attack any force that came near. Alexander built a causeway. He filled the water between the island and the mainland with rubble and timber and stone. His engineers worked for months. Tyre's defenders attacked constantly. Fires, sorties, naval strikes. Alexander rebuilt what they destroyed. He brought in warships from Cyprus and Phoenicia. After 7 months, the causeway reached Tyre's walls. The city fell. The island became a peninsula. You can still see the geography of that siege today. The causeway that Alexander built 2,300 years ago is still there, buried under a modern strip of land. His engineers literally changed the shape of the coastline. From Tyre, he moved south to Egypt. Egypt surrendered without a fight. The Egyptians had resented Persian rule. They greeted Alexander with something close to joy. Their priests recognized him. Their traditions absorbed him. He was crowned as pharaoh in the ancient ceremonies at Memphis. He visited the great temple of Pa. He made offerings in the Egyptian style. He was beginning to understand something important. Power was not just swords and armies. Power was meaning. Power was story. Power was becoming what people needed you to be. And then he made a journey that transformed him. He traveled west along the Mediterranean coast to a place called the Oracle of Siwa. Siwa was an oasis deep in the desert, far from any major city. The temple there was sacred to the Egyptian god Amun, whom the Greeks equated with Zeus. The journey was extremely difficult. Desert heat, sandstorms, the possibility of getting lost and dying. Alexander went anyway. We do not know exactly what happened inside that temple. We do not know what the oracle told him. Alexander never fully revealed it. He said only that he had received the answer he was hoping for. But something changed in him after Siwa. He began to refer to himself as the son of Zeus Amun. He began to speak about his divine nature more openly. Some of his companions found this troubling. Greeks did not usually consider living humans to be gods. That was different. That was Eastern. That was strange. But Alexander was no longer just Greek. He was becoming something new, something that belonged to all the cultures he was absorbing. He founded a city at the edge of the Egyptian delta. He laid out its streets himself, reportedly using grain to mark the lines on the ground when he ran out of chalk. When birds ate the brain, some of his superstitious followers worried it was a bad omen. His city would feed the world. He named it Alexandria. There are many cities named Alexandria that he founded, but this one, at the mouth of the Nile, where the Mediterranean meets Africa, became one of the greatest cities in human history. It would house the largest library ever assembled in the ancient world. It would be a center of learning and trade and culture for 1,000 years. It still exists today. The city of Alexandria in Egypt carries the name of the young man who walked through the desert to ask a god who he really was. Part 7. Gaugamela and the Fall of the Persian Empire. Darius was building another army. While Alexander was in Egypt, the Persian king was gathering forces from across his vast empire. This time he would not be caught in a narrow coastal plain. He chose his ground carefully. A flat, open plain in what is now northern Iraq, called Gaugamela. There, Darius could use his numerical advantage. His cavalry could spread wide. His chariots could charge across unobstructed ground. The two armies met in 331 BC. Historians estimate Darius had somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 soldiers. Alexander had roughly 50,000. But Alexander had already won, not on the battlefield, in his mind. The night before the battle, Parmenio came to him. He suggested a night attack, surprise Darius in the darkness, reduce the Persian advantage. Alexander declined. He said he would not steal his victory. He slept, deeply, calmly. His officers had to wake him in the morning. He had slept through his own anxiety somehow. Or perhaps he felt no anxiety. Or perhaps he had simply decided not to feel it. The battle was extraordinary and terrifying. Persian chariots charged the Macedonian lines. Alexander's soldiers had been trained to open gaps and let the chariots through, then close behind them and deal with the drivers. They did exactly this. The chariots crashed through the line and were dealt with from behind. Then Alexander did what he always did. He identified the critical point. He saw a gap opening in the Persian line. He led his cavalry in a deep wedge directly toward that gap, directly toward Darius. The Persian king watched the Macedonian cavalry cutting through his formations toward him. He turned his chariot around. He fled again. And the Persian army, for the second time, collapsed when it saw its king abandon the field. The Persian Empire was over. Its cities fell one by one. The great treasury of Persepolis, with its unimaginable wealth, was captured. Alexander held a feast in the throne room of the Persian kings. And then, reportedly drunk and urged on by an Athenian woman named Thais, he set fire to the palace. He may have regretted it the next morning. He had wanted to rule through Persia, not destroy it. But the fire burned, and the greatest power in the ancient world was gone. Alexander was 25 years old. He had conquered everything between Greece and India in less than 5 years. But he was not done. He would never be done. That was the beautiful and tragic truth about Alexander. He could not stop. Part 8. The Long Road East. Darius fled east hoping to regroup. He never got the chance. His own nobles, led by a satrap named Bessus, arrested him. When Alexander's cavalry caught up to the Persian royal party, they found Darius already dying. He had been stabbed by his own men. Bessus had declared himself the new Persian king and fled further east. Alexander dismounted beside the dying Persian ruler. Some accounts say he wept. He covered Darius with his own cloak. He sent the body back to Persepolis for a royal burial. He hunted Bessus down, eventually capturing him and having him executed in the Persian manner as a traitor to his king. Alexander was now the legitimate ruler of the Persian Empire. He was not just a conqueror, he was the heir. But to the east, the empire continued. There were provinces in what are now Afghanistan and Central Asia that had not yet submitted. There were wild mountain peoples and steppes full of nomadic horsemen. And beyond that, there was a land that Aristotle had told him about, India. The campaigns in Afghanistan and Central Asia were brutal in ways that the earlier battles had not been. These were not open plains where phalanxes could march in formation. These were mountains, gorges, ambushes in the dark, guerrilla fighters who appeared out of nowhere and vanished before Alexander could bring his full army to bear. The region that is now Afghanistan resisted him for years. 2 years of exhausting mountain warfare that cost enormous casualties. He founded more cities. He built forts. He tried to hold what he had taken. But this was different territory from Egypt or Persia. These people did not have a center to capture. There was no treasury, no king, no palace that would symbolize defeat. It was the hardest fighting he had ever done. It was here, too, that Alexander made some of his worst decisions. In a drunken argument at a banquet, he killed Clitus, the same Clitus the Black, who had saved his life at the Granicus, who had severed the Persian's arm before it could cut Alexander down, a man who had known him since childhood. Alexander ran him through with a spear during the argument. He came to his senses almost immediately. He tried to turn the spear on himself before others stopped him. He locked himself in his rooms for 3 days, refusing to eat. He wept. He blamed himself. His court philosopher eventually convinced him to continue. But the death of Clitus marked something. The absolute power Alexander now held was changing him. The patience of those who disagreed with him was running out, and he was increasingly demanding the kind of divine honor that Persians gave to kings, prostrating themselves before him, not simply bowing as Greeks did. His Macedonian companions refused. Greeks did not bow to living men, they bowed to gods. The tension between his Greek identity and his new Persian identity was becoming dangerous. A conspiracy was discovered. Pages, the young servants of Alexander's inner circle, plotted to kill him. The plot failed, but it shook him. He pressed on. He married a Bactrian princess named Roxana. He was genuinely taken with her. She was courageous and sharp. And marrying her was also good politics, binding the region to him through family ties. Then he pushed into India. Part 9. India and the Edge of the World. Alexander crossed the Hindu Kush mountains in winter. His army was exhausted. They had been marching for years. But on the other side of those mountains was India, and nobody Greek had ever been there. He entered the Indus Valley in 326 BC. His army crossed rivers that were unlike anything they had seen. They encountered elephants in battle for the first time in a major engagement at the Hydaspes River, fighting against a king named Porus. Porus stood on the back of a great elephant and directed his army personally. He fought magnificently. His elephants terrified the Macedonian horses, who had never smelled them before. But Alexander had anticipated this. His phalanx infantry dealt with the elephants methodically. His cavalry found the flanks. And once again, Alexander's tactical flexibility and his men's absolute trust in him carried the day. After the battle, Alexander met Porus as a prisoner. He asked him how he expected to be treated. Porus said, "As a king." Alexander appreciated the answer. He did not destroy Porus. He made him a governor of his own territory, a local king under Alexander's overall authority. He added even more land to Porus's control as a reward for fighting so well. This was Alexander at his most interesting. He recognized competence and used it, rather than eliminating it. He wanted an empire of willing partners more than an empire of crushed survivors. But here is where the impossible finally happened. Alexander wanted to keep going. He had heard there were more kingdoms beyond the Ganges River, further east. He wanted to see them. His army refused. This had never happened before. His soldiers, who had followed him through deserts and over mountains and into battles they had no right to survive, stopped. They sat down and would not move. They had been away from home for 8 years. They were tired. Their equipment was rotting in the monsoon rain. They were covered in old wounds. Their boots were falling apart. And they were still getting further and further from Macedonia, with no end in sight. Alexander tried everything. He pleaded, he argued, he went into his tent and refused food for 3 days. He waited to see if they would change their minds. They did not. His general Coenus spoke on their behalf. He said the men were exhausted. He said they needed to go home. He said Alexander was great beyond measure, but even the greatest journey must turn around somewhere. Alexander stood at the Hyphasis River and looked east. He had to accept something he had never accepted before. There was a limit. He wept. Ancient sources say he wept from frustration and grief. He built 12 altars at the river's edge as a monument to mark the furthest point of his advance. Then he turned west. Part 10. The River and the Long Way Home. The journey home was not easy. It was not a triumphal march. It was one of the most dangerous undertakings of the entire campaign. Alexander decided to return, partly by sailing down the Indus River to the ocean, then following the coast back toward Persia. This meant building a fleet. In a river in India, miles from any major city, his engineers constructed hundreds of boats. They launched the fleet and began the long journey downstream. The Indians along the riverbank were not always welcoming. Several cities refused to surrender. Alexander stormed their walls personally, as he always did. At one city assault, he was badly wounded. He jumped over the wall alone. His officers, horrified, scrambled over after him. Inside, he was fighting 3 men alone. An arrow hit him in the chest. It penetrated his lung. He went down. His generals covered him until the gate was broken down and troops poured through. He survived, but barely. While he was unconscious, word spread through the army that he was dead. The grief was overwhelming. Men who had fought beside him for years wept openly. When he appeared again, pale and weak, carried on a litter, then later on a horse, the army reportedly broke into tears again. Not from grief this time, from relief. He was still theirs. He was still alive. He reached the coast of the Indian Ocean, fulfilled an ancient desire by wading into the unknown southern sea and making offerings to Poseidon. Then he sent the fleet west under his admiral Nearchus to explore the coastline. He led the main army through the Gadrosian Desert in what is now Pakistan. It was the worst decision of his campaign. The desert was brutal, waterless, scorching. Thousands died of thirst and heat. More soldiers may have died on that march than in all his battles combined. He was trying to match a legendary march that an ancient queen called Semiramis was said to have attempted. He wanted to surpass the legends. The desert did not care about legends. He arrived in Persia, having lost perhaps a quarter of his army to thirst and exhaustion. He grieved those losses deeply. He began executing corrupt officers who had exploited their provinces while he was away. He reorganized his administration. He took stock of what he had built. And what he had built was staggering, an empire stretching from Greece to India, a network of cities spreading Greek language, Greek architecture, Greek ideas across an area that had never known them, trade routes connecting the Mediterranean to Central Asia to India, cultural exchanges that were already producing new forms of art, philosophy, religion. He was planning more. He wanted to explore Arabia. He wanted to possibly turn west and complete a circumnavigation of Africa. He wanted to conquer Carthage and Spain and perhaps reach the Western Ocean. He was back at Babylon now, planning the next campaign. And then, everything stopped. Part 11, The Death of a World. In the spring of 323 BC, Alexander began to feel unwell. He had attended a long banquet, drinking heavily. He developed a fever. Modern historians have debated for decades what killed him. Typhoid fever, complicated by his lung injury, poisoning, too much alcohol over too many years? We do not know for certain. What we know is that the fever came and did not leave. His companions kept watch at his bedside. His soldiers, hearing their king was sick, lined up in such numbers that they had to be let through in shifts just to see him. He was too weak to speak by then, but he reportedly raised his hand to each of them as they passed. A small gesture, a recognition. He still saw them. He still knew them. When he was asked, by those gathered at his deathbed, to whom he left his empire, he gave an answer that has haunted history ever since. To the strongest, he said. Or perhaps he said, to the most worthy. The accounts vary. His voice may have been too faint to hear clearly. It may have been a joke, a philosophical statement, or simply a dying man who no longer had the energy to answer a question he had perhaps never truly solved. He died on June 10, 323 BC. He was 32 years old. In 12 years, he had marched his army more than 30,000 kilometers. He had fought major battles from Greece to India without ever losing one. He had founded somewhere between 70 and 100 cities that spread Greek language and culture across the ancient world. He had opened trade routes that would carry goods and ideas between civilizations for centuries, and then he was gone. His empire did not survive him. His generals divided it among themselves in a series of bloody wars that lasted 40 years. The empire shattered into pieces. but those pieces carried his influence. Egypt under the Ptolemies, the dynasty that would eventually produce Cleopatra, spoke Greek and blended Greek and Egyptian culture. Persia absorbed Greek artistic traditions while preserving its own. India recorded the encounter in its own stories. The Greek language became the common tongue of the educated world, which is why the New Testament was written in Greek 400 years later. The ideas that Aristotle had given Alexander, the idea that the world was knowable, that it could be studied and measured and understood, spread east and west, eventually becoming the foundation of modern science. The libraries that bloomed in cities like Alexandria preserved and transmitted the knowledge of the ancient world to the medieval scholars who would build on it. Alexander's shadow is everywhere, in the way cities are laid out, in the spread of the Greek alphabet, in the routes that goods still travel between east and west, in the idea, which was radical in his time, that different cultures could learn from each other. Part 12. The Modern Mirror. When we look at Alexander's story, what are we really seeing? We are seeing something very human. We are seeing what happens when a person has been told from the very beginning that they are meant for something great, that the ordinary rules do not quite apply to them, that the horizon is not a limit, but an invitation. This is a gift, and it is also a curse. The gift is that it creates energy, the capacity to attempt things that should be impossible. The curse is that it makes stopping almost impossible too. Alexander could not stop, even when his soldiers wept and refused to march further, even when his own body was failing, even when the people who loved him were begging him to rest. He kept looking east. And you know this feeling, maybe not in the dramatic form of armies and conquests, but you know what it is to feel driven past your own limits, to feel that stopping would be a kind of failure, to feel that rest is something that has to be earned rather than something that is simply owed to you. Alexander never quite learned to rest, and perhaps that is the final lesson his story offers. Not the battles, not the cities, not the map of the world that carries his trace. The lesson is that even the most extraordinary life needs stillness, that the strongest person in any room is sometimes the one who knows when to put down the spear, that Bucephalus, the great horse, needed water and shade too, that the army, which would follow Alexander anywhere, still needed to sleep. You have followed your own army today, through whatever battles this day required, through whatever deserts you crossed without enough water, through whatever walls you climbed that did not need to be climbed quite so urgently. You can put it down now. The empire will still be there in the morning. Part 13. The Stars Above Babylon. Alexander died in Babylon. The city of Babylon stood near what is now the city of Hilla in southern Iraq. If you could stand there tonight on that ancient ground, you would see the same stars that shone above him, the same stars that his soldiers slept under on the plains of Persia, the same stars that reflected in the waters of the Indus River as his fleet sailed toward the ocean. The stars have not moved very much in 2,300 years, not enough for the human eye to notice. So when you look up at a clear night sky, you are looking at what Alexander saw. The same Orion, the same bright band of the Milky Way. He looked at those stars and felt the distance between himself and home. He looked at them and felt the pull of what lay beyond the horizon. He looked at them the way curious people have always looked at stars, with longing and wonder and that particular human ache that has no name. The ache of knowing that the world is enormous and that one life is not enough to see all of it. Tonight you do not need to see all of it. Tonight the world is exactly as large as the room you are lying in. The sheets are warm, your breathing is slowing, the busy thoughts are getting quieter. If this journey through Alexander's world helped you feel something, maybe a sense of connection to the long, strange story of our species, maybe a moment of wonder at how much one life can contain, then it has done its work. If you would like to subscribe, I would be glad to have you back for the next journey. If you feel like leaving a comment, tell me where you are in the world tonight, what city, what country, what time it is where you are. I read every one. Someone will be listening to this from the city that Alexander himself walked through. From Turkey, from Egypt, from Pakistan, from Afghanistan, from Greece. His cities are still there, his roads are still used, his language echoes in the words we use every day without knowing their origin. You are the descendant of a world he helped create. And tonight you share his sky, the same darkness, the same stars, the same ancient need to close your eyes and let the day become a dream. Alexander raced through his life at full speed until it stopped. You do not need to race, you have already done enough today. Let the fires in Persepolis go cold, let the fleet rest in the harbor at Alexandria. Let the army camp on the plain beside the river, and let the horses drink, and let the soldiers tell their stories around the fire. Let the young king, for once, sleep. And let yourself sleep too. The world will be waiting in the morning. The horizon will still be there. There will be more questions then, more wonders, more of the story. But tonight is for rest. Tonight is yours. Close your eyes. The stars are above you. The same ones that have watched over every dreamer, every traveler, every person who ever looked at the sky and felt both very small and impossibly important at the same time. You are part of that long human story. You always have been.